Welcome back to Vendée Radio. It is the 19th of March, the Feast of St. Joseph, in the year of our Lord 2024. This evening, I am joined once again by a friend of the channel, Colonel James Bogle, barrister. Colonel Bogle, welcome back to Vendée Radio.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be back.
And we will be joined shortly by Mr. Charles Coulombe, another friend of the channel. Colonel Bogle is currently a barrister in practice in Britain for 30 years, a former British cavalry officer, and a writer and historian. He's also a Knight of Malta and was president of the International Una Voce Federation, promoting the traditional Roman rite from 2013 to 2015. As is apposite for today's topic, he is the co-author of the book A Heart for Europe, The Lives of Emperor Charles and Empress Zita of Austria-Hungary. We will get on to Blessed Charles, I think, a little bit later once Mr. Charles Coulombe joins us. But firstly, to say that nearly 2 years ago, I broadcasted a programme on the suicide of Europe, the church in Europe before the First World War, the first in a projected 3-part series. And I'm afraid this series has become rather protracted, a bit like the First World War itself. But we're now picking it up again, and we're going to discuss the course of the war itself and the role the church played in particular. So in that first podcast, Dr. Alan Phimister and Mr. Coulombe looked at the origins of the catastrophe of the First World War and how this heralded the end of Christendom. They covered the state of the church and state in La Belle Epoque, and the rising tide of the ideologies of nationalism, socialism, and liberalism, which were vying for men's hearts. They discussed Pope Leo XIII's social doctrine, St. Pius X's papacy, and the broader Catholic revival of the 19th century. So we're going to pick up there and focus on the course of the war itself. I'd like to begin, Colonel Bogle, with a consideration of St. Pius X's last days, which were in the summer of 1914 as Europe headed into war, which left him very depressed and unfortunately a prophetic witness for the destruction that was about to be wrought across the continent.
Yes, indeed. As we discovered when writing the book about the Emperor Charles, called A Heart for Europe, published by Gracewing, I'd like to say available at all fine bookstores, but it has perhaps a slightly more limited distribution, but it's certainly readily available in the United States. And I think we're on to about the 6th edition, so it's proved quite popular. Yes, in the course of that, we discovered that during a papal audience in which the then Archduke Karl and his wife, the Archduchess Zita, born Princess Zita of Bourbon-Parme. They were astonished by the Pope telling or referring to the emperor being the Archduke, as he then was, becoming the future emperor. And they corrected the Pope. This was Pope St. Pius X, corrected him and said, "You do mean my uncle, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand." And the Pope said, "No, it's going to be you." And they didn't know what to say. They were stunned and were silenced by that, and came out afterwards and said to each other that he must have just got it wrong or made a mistake or something. But of course, what the Pope was quite extraordinarily able to predict was the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and in effect also the death halfway through the First World War of the Emperor Franz Joseph in 1916, which brought the Emperor Charles to the throne. And when that happened, he must have been very surprised and apprehensive to discover that the prediction of St. Pius X had come true. I think if I'd been in his shoes, I would then have gone away and carefully studied the works of St. Pius X to see what else he predicted, lest it too become true and come to pass. Yeah. So and as you rightly say, St. Pius X had done his best, insofar as he could, to try to stop that terrible war. As in due course, his successor, Pope Benedict the 15th, tried to end it once it had started, and so of course did the Emperor Charles, but they were unfortunately unsuccessful, because the powers that had effectively conspired to bring the war about were not at all interested in either the Pope or the Catholic Emperor. They had other fish to fry. Essentially, that of the secularists, the nationalists, the secret societies, all of whom were conspiring to get rid of Catholic monarchy, Christian monarchy in general, and to replace it with this brave new world of secular nationalism, a world which, of course, has led the whole of Europe down the wrong path, which is where we are now.
Yes, and one of the things that Pope St. Pius X predicted and greatly grieved him was that the passions for war were stirring among the people of Europe, and that in a certain sense the governments would be unable to prevent that being unleashed in warfare between the nations. Perhaps not their acknowledging quite as much the guiding influence of certain ministers, as you say, which were very important. For instance, in Italy, which of course joined the war later in 1915, it was seen as a good way of settling domestic problems or of distracting people from domestic problems, the age-old tactic. And the foreign minister, Sonnino, was one of the most anti-clerical ministers to have held office in the Kingdom of Italy. And Benedict himself saw the hand of Freemasonry in the moves towards the country entering the war. Many Masons in public life would have seen themselves as natural allies of the French Third Republic, in which they were also strong over and against the Catholic Habsburg Empire. There has been a Masonic memorandum come to light from this period, calling for a society, quote, without altars and without thrones. And the relationship between the kingdom and the Vatican was certainly not absent from the Italian government's calculations. In the secret Article 15 of the Treaty of London, in which Italy agreed to enter
That's right.
Which is only made public 2 years later after the Russian Revolution, following false denials by the Italian ministers that it existed. It was laid down that, quote, France, Great Britain and Russia shall support any such opposition as Italy shall make to any proposal in the direction of introducing a representative of the Holy See in any peace negotiations or negotiations for the settlement of questions raised by the war.
Yeah. So Sonnino's first name was Sidney, Baron Sidney Sonnino. His father was an Italian Jew who converted to Anglicanism, and his mother was a Welsh woman called Georgina Menhennet. And they gave their son the name Sidney. So he was actually raised as an Anglican by his family, because remember, the Church of Wales is Anglican. And his grandfather had emigrated, I think, from Livorno to Egypt and built up a huge fortune as a banker. So he had a very fortunate background from that point of view. But of course, he, because of his background, was ill disposed towards the papacy and well disposed towards the Freemasonic governments of Britain and America, and indeed France, of course. And as you rightly say, despite the British government and indeed the French government disparaging the concept of secret diplomacy, that is precisely what they did with the Treaty of London in 1916, in which they inveigled, through the good offices of Sidney Sonnino, Italy into supporting the war, and essentially using Italy as a way of carving slices out of the old Austrian Empire, or at least the northern part of it. And doing so by promising Italy that it would get those very parts of the Austrian Empire, which now, of course, lie within northern Italy, namely the Alto Adige, the Trentino, the South Tyrol, all of which had been for centuries part of the Holy Roman Empire and then the Austrian Empire. And nationalist Italy had absolutely no claim over them whatsoever. But they wanted everything up to the Alps, the so-called Fino al Brennero. In other words, ending at the Brenner Pass over the Alps, which pass joins Austria and Italy. I know that part of Italy quite well because I go skiing there, or I used to before COVID. And it's still German speaking to this day, although most of them can actually speak Italian. And the successive Italian governments from Mussolini onwards have tried to italicize that part of northern Italy, but it's still very Germanic and Austrian. And indeed, so much so that in the 60s, you had a South Tyrol separatist movement seeking to break away from the frankly incompetent and corrupt government of Italy in Rome. That has since died down, but you now, of course, have the wider concern of northern Italians in the Lega del Norte and other political movements and parties in Italy that want, again, if not to break away, but certainly to have such a larger measure of self-government that they're no longer under the thumb of the corrupt government in Rome. I might add, by way of a bit of an eccentricity, that although it's called the Lega del Norte because most of its party members and voters are in the north of Italy, there is one part of southern Italy that always regularly votes, if not for Lega del Norte, then for one of the parties of a similar stamp, namely the island of Lampedusa, which is the southernmost island of Italy. And the reason for that is because that is where all the Muslim immigrants come to when they cross over the Mediterranean Sea. And Lampedusa citizens are fed up to the back teeth with it. So they all vote Lega del Norte, which wants to separate from the corrupt Roman government that allows this to happen. But that part is, as I say, it's still very much Germanic speaking. And indeed, the national hero of the whole of the Tyrol, the innkeeper, soldier, patriot, and Habsburg loyalist Andreas Hofer, is still very much remembered in both North and South Tyrol. North Tyrol, of course, is in Austria, South Tyrol in Italy. and is still very much the national hero of the Tyrol, and the national anthem of the Tyrol is the song of Andreas Hofer. So they ain't going to be handing over to Italy, at least culturally, anytime soon. So although the Italians succeeded in annexing that part of Austria during the First World War, they haven't done so very successfully. I might add that the Italians did so and gave themselves medals for doing so in the so-called victory of Vittorio Veneto, by waiting until the armistice had been declared, watching the Austrian soldiers hand over their weapons, then jumping into their vehicles and onto their horses, riding like hell for 48 hours until they got to the Brenner Pass, and declaring it a glorious victory of Italian arms against the Austrians. Well, it was anything but. It was a piece of chicanery, if not indeed downright treachery, which was no more a conquest by war than a straight out piece of theft or robbery. Because the reality is that the Italians were constantly being beaten back, not just by the Austrians, it must be said, because by then the Austrians were heavily augmented by the German forces, but the combination of the two thoroughly flattened the Italian army several times over. Not that the ordinary Italian wasn't brave and in some cases a good soldier, but most of the officers, certainly the very top brass of the Italian army, were all Freemasons, all anti-clericals, and all, frankly, pretty corrupt and incompetent. The only one who was halfway decent, General Cadorno, he was nonetheless beaten by the combination of the Austrian and Germans. And most famously of all, they were beaten at the Battle of Caporetto in 1917. The Italian army was absolutely wiped out. And that is why the French and the British armies had to send, or governments had to send, large contingents of British and French soldiers to fill the gap, because the Italian army had been, frankly, decimated by the Battle of Caporetto. I might also add that the Emperor Charles strongly resisted several demands of the German government as being immoral. He refused to shell Italian cities where there were civilians. He refused to use submarine warfare against civilian shipping, which the Germans were already doing and wanted to continue to do. And he refused to use poison gas, which, as we know, was used extensively on the Western Front. And a certain Lance Corporal in the German army, who was gassed in the course of a gas attack, so detested it that when the Second World War came, and he found himself, or had made himself, the Führer of Nazi Germany, i.e. one A. Hitler, he didn't and forbade the use of poison gas by the German armies, because he didn't want there to be a retribution in the form of poison gas used against the German army. He having remembered the day when he was himself gassed. And that is an interesting byproduct. But the Emperor Charles partly prevailed in his insistence, and certainly no Austrian gunners or submariners engaged in warfare against civilians. And of course, interestingly, they were nonetheless successful against certainly on the Italian front. The one thing the Emperor Charles didn't succeed in doing was preventing Lenin from being sent in a sealed train to the Finland station in St. Petersburg to start the Russian Revolution. He, despite being in his 20s, had better foresight than the old men who were governing Germany, who thought it would be a jolly good idea to send a communist revolutionary to start a revolution in Russia so as to relieve the Russian front. But the Emperor Charles had the foresight and percipience to see that a revolution in Russia would be a total disaster for the whole world, and Europe in particular. And of course, he was right and they were wrong. And Lenin duly started the Russian Revolution in 1917. This is one of the great problems of world wars or any extensive war, is that it weakens the home defense capacity, and therefore makes it easier for revolutionaries to seize their opportunity, because most of the armed might of the nation is away fighting the war. And so seizing that opportunity, which they would never otherwise have had if there had been no First World War. The Russians started the Russian Revolution. The Italians had already had the Italian Revolution, but continued it yet further. The way was prepared for the Spanish Revolution in 1936. And of course, the Irish had their uprising right bang in the middle of the war in 1916 as well. This is something that is completely forgotten by anyone who is of any Hibernian descent, and apart from a few learned historians and other Irishmen who take the trouble to learn their own country's history, by the majority of Irish people. And that is that the 1916 rebels were cordially detested by the rest of Ireland, not least the Dubliners, because they all had sons away fighting in the First World War. And when the rebels were finally defeated and taken through the streets of Dublin, the Dubliners threw bricks at them and shouted catcalls at them, calling them traitors, because they and backstabbers, because they considered them to be stabbing Ireland in the back when Ireland was fighting a war against Germany. But this is completely forgotten now, and they are all portrayed as great, wonderful heroes. Now, I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that it was right to have them secretly court-martialed and shot, but the fact is they were not popular. And the whole mythos of the 1916 rebellion is something that was completely manufactured after the First World War was over, in a similar way that the October Revolution in Russia was made into a great event that it wasn't by the subsequent communist government that had taken over. Revolutionaries may not be very good at fighting wars, but by jingo, they're extremely expert at telling lies, particularly lies about history. And that, I'm afraid, goes also for the Italian revolutionaries.
The Bastille, the storming of the Winter Palace, these kind of historical non-events that are turned.
Yeah, non-events. Absolutely. I mean, the storming of the Bastille was what? I think there were 11 prisoners in there.
Yep.
2 of whom were mentally ill.
Yeah.
I mean, the great victorious, glorious victory of the revolution, it just simply wasn't. It was a minor sideshow. Yeah.
One of the things that the Vatican and the newly elected Pope Giacomo della Chiesa, James of the Church, Benedict XV, had to contend with were the nationalistic sentiments among the clergy. And this is quite shocking, really, the extent of often their disloyalty, open disloyalty. But even at the conclave, when Cardinal Hartmann, the Archbishop of Cologne, met the Archbishop of Brussels, Cardinal Mercier, he said, "I hope that we shall not speak of war," to which his Belgian colleague replied, "And I hope that we shall not speak of peace." And that's very early in the conflict. But time and again, one saw the peace efforts of Benedict XV ignored by national clergy. There are examples from every country. The American Cardinal James Gibbons, Archbishop of Baltimore, he wrote to President Wilson, "We are all true Americans, inspired by the holy sentiments of truest patriotic fervor and zeal. We stand ready to cooperate in every way possible with our president and our national government, to the end that the great and holy cause of liberty may triumph." Just one example.
By which he meant what? The fighting of the First World War.
Yes.
I mean,
American involvement.
the sheer astonishing stupidity of such a remark is nakedly obvious so soon as you utter it. I mean, the idea that they were fighting a war, the First World War, for freedom, let alone American freedom, is farcical in the extreme. But unfortunately, there were such sentiments, as you rightly point out. There were, of course, reverse sentiments. There has always been, among American conservatives, a policy of what some call isolationism, but which is perhaps more sensibly described as self-preservation. Why should you go across the seas to fight and die in a war which is of no interest to America whatever? Well, I suppose it's of interest, but it's not going to damage or harm American interests to such an extent that it's worth sending young men over to die. The argument is, of course, different in the Second World War, where there was an argument for, and a very clear argument for fighting the war against Nazism and America's assistance made a great deal of difference. But the First World War, I mean, why were they there? What was the point? Mm-hmm. What were they there for? And if they thought they were fighting for freedom, well, whose freedom? The reality is, they certainly made a difference to the final result of the war. But I mean, if one is entirely frank, did it really matter who won them? Well, I mean, that sounds like heresy to the British and French side. But supposing the Germans had won them, or the Austrians, would things have been so terribly different? Probably not. I mean, maybe.
Well, that's one of the puzzles of the First World War, isn't it, Colonel Bogle? What kept the powers fighting after the full horror of industrial warfare had been unleashed? None of the main combatants had major ideological differences, at least at the beginning, it would seem. None of the powers wanted the territory of the other powers. Germany did not want to rule France. Russia did not want to rule Germany. Economically, the combatants their interests were so intertwined that the war was no way advantageous. Andrew Willard-Jones alleges that it was fought because the gods of nationalism, mass economy, and mass society demanded that it be fought, and no one was willing to oppose their will. Pride seeking glory was the cause of the slaughter.
Yeah, well, I would go a little bit further and say that it was the realization of, if not an overt and explicit conspiracy, nonetheless a hidden, implied or inferred conspiracy of the secularist secret societies to banish Christian monarchy from Europe, and in so doing to continue what they regarded as the good work of the French Revolution over 100 years earlier. The whole history of the 19th century is a history of political revolution, trying again and again, and throughout the 19th century largely failing, to re-establish the Bonapartist hegemony of revolution that had been relinquished when Bonaparte was defeated. So you get revolution in virtually every country. Spain, it was a continuous revolution and counter-revolution throughout the 19th century. Ditto Italy. The 1848 revolutions was a great culmination. And out of that revolutionary upheaval, you then started to get a whole political philosophy of revolution, which culminated in the Communist Manifesto. And we know what appalling destruction that wrought. But throughout the 19th century, making a certain headway against Christian monarchy, they were dissatisfied that they hadn't made anything like enough. You still have the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you still have the German Empire, you still have the Russian Empire, you still had kingdoms all over Europe, and they weren't satisfied and weren't going to be satisfied until they had eliminated it altogether. And eventually, I would say, with a considerable degree of explicit explicit desire and determination, the secularists, both secretly and not so secretly, were looking towards a conflagration like the First World War in order to finally extirpate Christian monarchy, which they succeeded in doing. And they didn't care how many young men died, so long as they got rid of Christian monarchy. Now, it's bad enough that they were willing to sacrifice so many millions of young lives for such a worthless cause. But what is even worse is that the cause was so utterly worthless, because in getting rid of Christian monarchy, what did they usher in? They ushered in communism, Nazism, fascism, with all that implied, and therefore 21 years later, a yet further Second World War, with yet further loss of life, and of course a complete political upheaval from which we are still suffering to this very day. So these men, and they were largely men and old men at that, were the arch enemies of civilization and society, but they had found their way into government and had their hands on the levers of power. And they weren't going to rest until they had achieved their nefarious aims. And so we got the First World War, in which, tens of thousands or millions were killed. And the war continued because, firstly, on the Western Front, because there were developments in technology that meant that each side, as the technology developed, thought that they could win the war and score a knockout blow. Particularly good on the subject are the so-called revisionist historians of the First World War, like, for example, Professor Peter Caddick-Adams, who I was at Sandhurst with, and some of his colleagues at the Staff College and Cranwell University. They have, to a large extent, dealt with the particular school of history, and perhaps even to some extent the myth of the officers, particularly British and French officers, in the First World War, and I suppose the German officers as well, as being, as they were described by, for example, Alan Clark in one of his histories, as lions led by donkeys. He wrote a book called The Donkeys. I can't remember, it was one or the other, in which he perpetuated the view that the French, British, and German officers were all aristocratic dolts. It's actually not true at all, as Caddick-Adams demonstrates. They, in fact, were seeking to exploit developments in technology. So, at the beginning of the war, soldiers going in wearing forage caps, and shrapnel had not long since been invented by Sir John Shrapnel, and I think his first name was John. And of course, a cloth cap, a forage cap, is completely useless against shrapnel, and so you sustained a whole lot of head wounds. The Germans had the Pickelhaube, but even that was not particularly proof against shrapnel. So they then developed the coal scuttle helmet, and the British developed their own style of helmet, which was actually taken from the style of helmet that was used in the 100 Years' War by British troops against French troops. And that was one development of technology. There was then there were a number of them. There were the increase in the type and strength and caliber of artillery munitions, so that they thought they could shell the heck out of the enemy and so destroy them that it would be a simple walkover by the infantry. That of that did not succeed, as we discovered in the Battle of the Somme, the worst ever day in the history of the British Army, where 60,000 became casualties on day one, 20,000 of them killed. And that day, by the way, interestingly, was the 1st of July, 1916. 1st of July, of course, as we know, was, up until Paul VI abolished it, the Feast of the Precious Blood. Well, precious blood indeed was spilt on that day in 1916, with 20,000 British troops killed and 60,000 as casualties, and more, of course, to follow in the remaining Battle of the Somme. So that explained that one. And then there was, of course, the development of poison gas, and each side thought that they could win the war by the use of poison gas. And then there was further development in technology in the form of mining and sapping, which of course is a long history. I mean, the Turks and the Viennese in the siege of Vienna used sapping and mining to try and defeat each other in the siege of Vienna. But this reached a particular level of technological development in the First World War, and so you had tunnels dug under the enemy's trenches, filled with explosives, and huge, enormous explosions going off. But that didn't do it either. You had developments in rifling, in the rifles, in bayonets were developed that were bigger and longer and more effective. You had developments in barbed wire entanglement to hold up the enemy advances. And then, of course, you ultimately had the development of the tank, which was thought to be a war-winning development. But even that didn't do it, although it certainly took the enemy, the Germans, by surprise and secured a very considerable amount of territory. A lot of that territory was then won back again. And so in 1918, towards the end of the war, the front line was more or less back where it had been at the beginning of the war. And ultimately what did it was just complete exhaustion. And both sides were running out of troops. And it was simply a matter of who collapsed first. And that was the Germans. Of course, the so-called Dolchstoßlegende was then formulated after the war, that the German army had in fact been stabbed in the back by liberals, Freemasons, Jews, etc., you name it. And that provided the ideological ammunition for the Nazi Party to capitalize upon. They called them the November criminals, who ended up by capitulating. So even at the end of the war, the nationalistic feeling was still so strong that even in a state of total exhaustion, with so many people killed, so much resources wasted, they were still arguing over whether or not the war should have continued. But it was a close run thing, and it could have just as easily have been the Brits and the French who capitulated. But in the end, it was the Germans, and we know what happened thereafter.
With all of these technological developments, you see the triumph of the machine over man. These developments enabled by the Industrial Revolution, which transform the character of war utterly. As you say, the scale of the slaughter. The first enormous battle for the sacred soil of France for the French took place 10 miles north of the border in the Belgian province of Luxembourg. It's centered on the village of Rossignol, which means nightingale. Few have heard of it, and it's rarely mentioned in the same breath as Verdun, the Somme, or Passchendaele. But more French soldiers died at Rossignol on the 22nd of August 1914 than on any other day in French history before or since. More than 27,000 were killed in 12 hours, which is about half the number of American soldiers killed in Vietnam from 1959 to 1975. The average death rate was 2 French soldiers every 3 seconds. Statistics can have a mildly anesthetic effect on the imagination, but this one translates itself easily into the sinister crepitation of a ticking clock. And for Ernst Junger, after the Battle of the Somme, he said the war and life in general had changed complexion entirely. He said here, chivalry had disappeared for always. Like all noble and personal feelings, it had to give way to the new tempo of battle and to the rule of the machine. Wars are waged by technicians. Here, the new Europe revealed itself for the first time in combat. So though World War I was fought, at least in the beginning, with some consideration of a sort of vestigial chivalric code, maybe most clearly in the air combat, before too long, the all semblance of honor and glory had been utterly dissipated by the destruction of modern warfare. Austria's aged emperor, Franz Joseph, when he received one day's reports from the front and the casualty list, was heard to mutter, "There is no longer anything elegant about war."
Yes. Well, indeed. Of course, Verdun was just a horrible bloodbath in which the French army was sent again and again and again against the German citadels, and likewise the Germans against the French, with utterly pointless slaughter. I mean, the French casualties were, I think, the highest, if not the highest, certainly up amongst the highest. For that reason, it was just a bloodbath, and utterly pointless. And I think at one stage, there were a number of mutinies in the French army because it was such a bloodbath. And as you say, the technology of modern war had made attacking a very dangerous business. The technology of defense, particularly the machine gun, trench warfare, meant that traditional methods of attack, essentially just a frontal attack, a completely hopeless form of warfare. That tactics for attack now have been, of course, considerably developed since those days. We didn't in those days have what we now have in the form of fire and maneuver, where one part of a squad or a platoon will move while the other part is firing, so as to keep the enemy's head down. It was just up over the trenches and walk towards the enemy trenches. Well, if you're being fired upon by machine guns, then of course you end up with Verdun or the Somme. But the generals in each case thought that the technology that had been recently developed would compensate and make up for that, but that turned out to be not so. The idea in the case of the Battle of the Somme was that there would be such a furious artillery barrage and bombardment that there'd be nothing left of the German trench lines or their dugouts, and so the infantry could just simply come out of their trenches and walk over to the German trenches and take them over. Well, in fact, that's not what happened. The Germans hid in their dugouts, which were proof against the British artillery and French artillery. And as soon as the barrage was lifted and the British and French infantry went over the top, they came out of their dugouts, bringing with them their machine guns, and fended off the attack with great slaughter. But as I say, it's easy for us nowadays to look back and say lions led by donkeys. But the technology having developed, it was understandable to a certain extent, at any rate, that the generals thought, well, we're going to, this is a battle-winning, if not a war-winning development. Let's try it. But there were nonetheless, of course, some generals who were less, shall we say, thoughtful about how they conducted their campaigns, and they perhaps didn't have such a concern for their soldiers as they ought to have, and as certainly we would try to have today. Famously, the Newfoundland Regiment at the Battle of Beaumont Hamel gained their spurs by virtually being wiped out. They had one regiment, and don't forget that Newfoundland was for a time independent, so they weren't Canadians at that time. They were very proud of being Newfoundlands, Newfies, but their military force in First World War was virtually wiped out at the Battle of Beaumont Hamel. I can't remember the exact numbers, but something like out of 1,000, there was 120 or something left. And they were, I think they were part of the empire, certainly, because they were given the title of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment as a result by King George V. Subsequently, Newfoundland, as a result, I think, of the Depression, went bankrupt. It wanted to become part of Britain, I think, not just part of the empire, but actually, like Malta, wanted to be part of Britain. But that wasn't acceptable to the British government. So in the end, they became part of Canada. But they had different days, I think, for celebrating their First World War remembrance days from Canada because of their original independence from Canada. But they were an example, and the Canadians themselves, particularly at Vimy Ridge, lost, I think, 60,000 casualties. And in those days, Canada was quite a small nation, and there was only, I think, 6 million Canadians. So we're talking 1% of the whole population. It was a very big deal. And of course, if you go to the Menin Gate in Ypres, which is the gate leading out of Ypres to Menin, on the Menin Road, you will see all the names of soldiers, British soldiers and Imperial, actually, in those days, soldiers killed who have no known grave. I have two of my own relatives there. The highest ranking of them all was a brigadier general who was, I think, killed at Gellerveld. And there's a huge number of names. And one of the noticeable features is, wall after wall after wall after wall of Australian and New Zealand soldiers. They at least had the excuse that they were part of the empire, which America was not. But even so, they came 11,000 miles from Australia and New Zealand to fight in a war that could arguably be said to be of less direct significance for Australia and New Zealand. But nonetheless, they enthusiastically went, including my grandfather, who fought at Passchendaele and was on the staff of the 1st Australian Corps, then commanded by Lieutenant General Sir William Birdwood, a British officer from the Royal Horse Guards. I have a photograph of the staff of 1st Australian Corps, which was tiny by the standards of staff these days. I mean, I think there would have been less than 40 people on the whole staff, one of whom was my grandfather. Interestingly, in Australia, a campaign for and against conscription dominated the political scene for quite some time. The then Prime Minister, Billy Hughes, was very much an empire loyalist, as by and large the Australian Protestants tended to be. Not all of them. Some would have been conscientious objectors, Quakers, for example. Whereas Catholics were a mixed bag. Famously, the Archbishop of Melbourne, Daniel Mannix, who had been the rector of Maynooth College in Dublin, and because he was seen as a bit of a troublemaker, I mean, he was certainly no Sinn Féiner or IRA man, nothing like that, but seen as a bit of a troublemaker in the same sort of mould as Archbishop MacHale of Tuam. He was sent out to Australia and became Archbishop of Melbourne at the age of 50, where he remained for another 50 years, not dying until he was 100. And so he was still around in the late 60s. I think he died in 1969. And he had seen, he was born in the 19th century and had seen been rector of Maynooth and seen the First World War. He led a campaign to oppose conscription successfully, which infuriated the Empire loyalists. But no sooner had conscription been defeated and the government called for volunteers, hundreds of thousands of Australians volunteered, including many Catholics, including many Irish Catholics of Irish extraction. So they didn't mind going to fight the war. They just didn't want to be forced to go. After the war, the Archbishop Mannix was proposing to have a Blessed Sacrament procession through the streets of Melbourne. And the Orange-dominated Melbourne City Council refused a license to have the procession. I was told this story, by the way, by my father, who was certainly no Catholic, I being the first Catholic in my family since the Reformation. Mannix, who then had a huge following, and Catholics being quite an organised force in those days, protested so loudly that the City Council had to relent. And the procession went ahead, but the City Council said, well, we're not going to be responsible for any breaches of the peace. And Mannix said, well, don't worry, that'll be fine. I'll look after that. And the way he did it was he had a military escort for the Blessed Sacrament, consisting of 8 soldiers in uniform, all wearing their Victoria crosses, all of them Catholics. So unsurprisingly, there were no breaches of the peace. Nobody was going to throw bricks at Australian soldiers wearing the Victoria Cross, even if they were Catholics. Just a side light on that. It's of the nature of a world war, particularly in the modern age, where military technology ensures a very high level of destruction, that it is bound to have a very profound effect on the belligerent nations taking part. Although the profound effect in countries like Australia and New Zealand and America and Canada was more on the sort of national psyche, in the case of European nations, it had direct political effects because it eliminated the old Christian kingdoms and replaced them with largely secular Republican governments, which in turn failed dismally, like the Weimar Republic or the succession of Italian governments, preparing the way for totalitarian government, persuading the people to vote for these totalitarian governments on the basis that the replaced secular governments were so hopeless and corrupt that the only thing that could possibly make up for them was to have some strong man in charge, whether it was a Mussolini, a Stalin, or a Hitler. Again, as we know now, with utterly fatal consequences. So the beginning, middle, and end of the First World War was just one big fat disaster from end to end. Yeah. And as I say, what would have happened if supposing the Germans had won, supposing the Austrians had won? Big deal. Well, I mean, I don't want to disparage all those people who lost their lives defending what they thought to be right in the First World War, but taking a cold, hard, realistic look, I mean, what would have happened? Well, I suppose it's possible that parts of France would once again have been ruled by Germany, and that would have been very irksome to French nationalism. Ditto Italy, I don't think much would have happened in Britain, but after a few years, would the governments have been any different? Well, they might even have been better than what came after the First World War, because as we know, as a result of the Allies winning in the First World War, you then had the Treaty of Versailles, you had Wilson's 14-point plan, all together virtually ensured that there would be another war, and certainly created the disaster of recession and inflation in Germany, which prepared the way for Hitler. So maybe if the Germans had won, that wouldn't have happened. Maybe if the Germans had won, there wouldn't have been a Russian Revolution. But certainly, if the Emperor Charles had had his way and his peace plan had been endorsed in 1916 when he took over, not only would millions of lives have been saved, but the stability of Europe thereafter would have been guaranteed, at least to the extent of ensuring that there was no communist, Nazi, or even fascist government taking over in each of those respective countries. But no one was going to listen to a young emperor, least of all one who was also a Catholic and the successor of the Holy Roman Emperors, and a Habsburg to boot, and particularly not by those secularists who were determined to get rid of Christian monarchy and replace it with secular rule. They were just not going to listen. And the other, I mentioned that technology was what caused the war to extend, in that the various belligerent nations thought that the new technology would help them, would enable them to win. But at the same time, from the perspective of the Emperor Charles, if the Allies were winning, then his peace plans would be ignored by the French government, who would say, oh, well, we're winning. We don't need that. We don't need to discuss peace with the Emperor Charles. Conversely, if the Germans made gains, there would be no talk of peace. And however much the Austrian Emperor tried to persuade the German government, they said, no, we're winning, we're going to win. Stop talking about peace. So he was almost doomed to failure, despite the fact that he was the only one talking any kind of sense. And by the way, he was willing to give away more of his empire than even the Pope had recommended. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't the Pope's empire to give away. Mm-hmm. So that shows you the extent to which he was willing to make sacrifices for the cause of peace. There's a wonderful story of him and his wife being at a wartime lunch in which they disdained to get stuck in, as it were. And the Empress Zita had a conversation with General von Hotzendorf, who was although he was an Austrian and probably brought up Catholic, seems to have been far more in sympathy with the Freemasons. And she talked to him about ending the war and about all the people who were starving and who were dying. And he preposterously and arrogantly said, oh, I don't have any thought for lack of food. If I'm deprived of food, I just tighten my belt. And the Empress Zita said, well, with all due respect, General, it's easy for you to say that when you're standing in front of a table laden with food, which the families of your country, and particularly the soldiers, do not have the benefit of. He at least had the decency to shut his trap after that. But that was the sort of difference in mentality between Empress Zita and Emperor Charles and some members of the High Command. And if he had been listened to, not only by his own generals, but more importantly by the Allies, by the French and by the Germans, then the war might have ended very considerably earlier than it did. The French treacherously seized the letters that he had written, or made copies, well, didn't seize them, when they were taken by Prince Sixtus, Empress Zita's brother, as a negotiating strategy with the Quai d'Orsay and with the French government. They took them away and made copies of them, the so-called Luxembourg letters also. And then at an ill moment, released them to the media to disparage the reputation of the Emperor Charles, very successfully, so that simply ended up lengthening the war yet further. And when the Emperor Charles, or when the Prince Sixtus, I should say, was negotiating with the British government, the attitude of Lloyd George was not, oh, let's grasp the opportunity for peace and save lives. His attitude was, so Austria may be weakening, so let's consider an attack from the southern front so as to knock Austria out of the war. So the whole mentality was one of extreme belligerence, and that inevitably led to a huge amount of death. You would have thought that we would have learned our lesson, not so much in the Second World War, because that was a war that had greater moral justification, but now we have a war going on between Russia and Ukraine, which is once again a war of attrition, made even worse by the advance of technology, so that, when did it start? Was it February
22.
last year? 22.
Yeah.
It is now estimated that something like 1 million Ukrainians have been killed. 1 million already. I mean, once you develop technology of the sort that we now have for modern warfare, you can't be in the business of national wars like you used to have them.
Mm-hmm.
The armed forces of the civilized world can really only be used for operations like counterinsurgency or internal security, or at a push, something like the Falklands operation. But, all out war between nations, like Russia and Ukraine, is just out of the question in terms of wasted manpower and resources and money. I mean, billions of pounds and dollars have been given by the American government, taxpayers' money, and the European Union has recently given $50 billion euros to support the Ukraine war, and it hasn't made a difference. The Ukrainians are still losing. It seems to be a rerun of the First World War mentality. And the problem was, as I say, not so much the generals as the politicians. The politicians are the ones who like to engage in wars. Soldiers are very much in favor of avoiding wars because they know what they're like. And you have the same thing with Tony Blair when he wanted to go to war with Saddam Hussein, which has since backfired more to his disadvantage probably than the rulers of Iraq. But it's, once again, the generals said to him, Mr. Blair, are you out of your mind? Why do we want to be fighting a war in Iraq? And he, being a politician, seeing some advantage politically, thought it was a good idea. Well, it was exactly the same in the First World War, only perhaps more so. The politicians wanted to continue the war because they saw it as a way of achieving their political aims, which, as I say, were worthless political aims anyway, i.e. the aim of knocking out permanently and forever any form of Christian government in the continent, namely Europe, which had most benefited from having those very same Christian governments. It's an extraordinary beginning of the kind of mentality of national suicide that we see existing in the 21st century, where we no longer wish to send our young men off to die on the Western Front, so much as not to bother to have the children in the first place, or if we do have them, abort them out of existence, so that a culture and a people who are willing to have children are gradually going to take us over without firing a shot. If you are going to have a war, I suppose that's a much better way to have it than a fighting war with weapons. But the result is going to be the same. The losing side will be taken over. And I would say with much more long-lasting consequences than the consequences of losing the First World War, except for the loss of human life.
You're quite right. The moment of attrition and of sort of military stasis that the Russia-Ukrainian war is in at the moment, where just like in the First World War, battles are no longer decisive engagements, but become processes. And it's almost in the First World War a form of bourgeois warfare where effective captains were like captains of industry, effectively managing processes. And you mentioned Blessed Karl, one bright light in this moment of the lamps going out all over Europe. There was another bright light, fruit of a special grace at that time, the Christmas truce of 1914, a pause in the Masonic slaughter. When Pope Benedict XV had written on 7th of December 1914, he begged for an official truce between the warring governments. He asked, at least that the guns may fall silent upon the night the angels sang.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, of course, everybody at the beginning of the war thought, without a folly, I mean, anyone with any understanding of modern technology should have known better, that it was all going to be over long before Christmas. So there was still entertaining romantic notions of war right up until Christmas of 1914. And of course, you had, during that Christmas truce, British and German troops came out and played football with each other. That gave the London Irish the idea, and whenever they went over the top with a wonderful Irish sense of humour, they would kick a football as they were going towards the enemy lines. And there's a wonderful painting in the officers' mess of the London Irish Regiment of precisely that. These Irish boys going over the top, kicking a football ahead of them as they went. The Irish regiments, of course, is an entire story in and of itself, one that is now very tragically forgotten and very wrongly forgotten, because, of course, after the First World War, you then had the so-called War of Independence, what I would describe as the revolution of impudence, followed by the Irish Civil War, which gave the Irish the unfortunate reputation of never quite knowing what they were fighting for, but being prepared to fight to the death for it. There is unfortunately an element of truth in that when you look at the so-called War of Independence followed by the Civil War, in which Irishmen killed Irishmen. Before the First World War, the two great Irish politicians, John Redmond and John Dillon, who were the leaders of the Irish Independent Party, or Irish Parliamentary Party, had more or less persuaded the British government to grant Home Rule. So little is Irish history now understood that there are actually quite a lot of people who think Home Rule meant independence, in the same way that they think that the repeal of the Union 100 years earlier in the turn of the century, 19th century, and after, meant independence for Ireland. Didn't mean anything of the sort. The repeal of the Union meant repeal of the Act of Union of 1800, which got rid of the Irish House of Lords and House of Commons and imposed Westminster rule. And that was done because the Parliament before 1800 in Ireland was exclusively Protestant. Even Grattan's Parliament, which wanted to liberalise, was an almost entirely exclusively Protestant Parliament. So the reason why the Act of Union was passed was in order for government from Westminster to be imposed in order to ensure fairness to Irish Catholics, who, of course, were the vast majority, but were disenfranchised. And so thereafter, as Daniel O'Connell and others were preparing the ground for Catholic emancipation, once that came, the next movement was to restore the Irish Parliament, but this time to allow it for Catholics to vote for it and Catholics to stand in it. And that was what the repeal of the Union was about. It was another word for Home Rule. Eventually, Home Rule came in 1914. And by the way, this is another thing that's frequently forgotten. That was Home Rule for the whole of Ireland, not what is now the 26 counties, the whole of Ireland, including the north of Ireland, which resulted in the Curragh Mutiny, a so-called, wasn't actually a mutiny. What it was British officers who came from Ireland and were stationed in Ireland threatened to resign their commissions, which they were perfectly entitled to do if Home Rule was imposed upon Ireland. Well, the debates continued, but they were all interrupted by the war. And by 1920, with the Free State created, the Home Rule Bill was redundant. And so it was repealed in 1920. But John Redmond and John Dillon went round the country saying, look, we've got Home Rule. We're going to get it implemented. But we've got to fight the war against the Germans and also to save Belgium, which is Catholic Belgium. And that was so successful, and this is another fact that is so often not known, that there were twice as many members of the British Army from what is now the Republic than there were from what is now the province of Northern Ireland. There was the 10th and the 16th divisions, Irish divisions from the south, but only one division, the 36th Ulster Division, in the north. And in order to get into the 36th Ulster Division, you had to sign the Solemn League and Covenant declaring the Pope Antichrist. So, of course, they weren't going to have too many Catholics in the Ulster, whereas anybody could join the 10th or the 16th. And you had all of those great Irish regiments in the 10th and the 16th, the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, the Leinster Rifles, the Connaught Rangers, the Royal Munster Rifles, and so on and so on and so on, all of which have now been completely forgotten. Land was bought by the government to prepare the way for their memorials, but after the Free State took over and then later the Republic, they weren't interested in celebrating Irishmen who had fought in British uniform. And in fact, to be fair to Mary McAleese, although I'm no great fan of hers, she is a great secularist. She pretends to be a Catholic, but she's not really. But to her credit, she was preparing the way to use those lands to build the long overdue memorials to the Irish regiments in the 10th and 16th divisions. The regimental associations still continue, and there is still some hope that their memorials may well be built in the Republic of Ireland. But, we're now 100 years since the First World War ended, or very nearly, more than 100 years, and they haven't been built, and the Irish regiments have been largely forgotten. And it's high time they were remembered. One or two individuals are remembered. For example, Father Willie Doyle, S.J., was a chaplain to, I think, the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, is remembered largely for both for his piety and also his heroism and courage. And we know quite a lot about him because he wrote home to his parents about what it was like on the front and what it was like with being in a regiment of the Irish soldiers. And he was several times shelled, bombed, covered in mountains of dirt, very nearly killed, but survived right up until the war was very, very nearly over, and then was killed by a shell. But he was, like a lot of the Catholic chaplains, constantly out in no man's land, because it was his role to administer the sacraments and therefore to anoint the dead, and if possible to give them viaticum before they died. And he was permitted, even in those days, to anoint anybody, whether unless, of course, they were deeply hostile to Christianity, Catholicism in particular. And so he did so. It was notorious that the only religions, by and large, whose ministers would go out into no man's land and risk their lives were the Catholic chaplains and the Salvation Army. most of the other chaplains were safely behind their own front line, out of harm's way. But the Catholic chaplains and the Salvation Army, and to be fair, some other clergymen were out in the front line. But eventually the Anglicans did it, famously with Woodbine Willie. It was called Woodbine Willie because he went out with a packet of cigarettes, because if you're a Protestant Anglican, you couldn't administer the sacraments that you didn't believe in. So you would all you could do is take a packet of cigarettes or a whole lot of cigarettes and hand them out to the soldiers you found in no man's land, or perhaps take them a drink of water or something stronger. But the Catholic chaplains knew exactly what they had to do, and that is they had to go out and anoint. And Willie Doyle writes about this, and his heroism was noticed by his commanding officer and even by his brigade commander. So he won the I think he certainly won the MC. Whether I have an idea that he might have got a DSO as well. No, I think he only got the MC, but he was put up for the DSO and a VC several times over. But as his biographer says, the triple disqualification of being a Catholic, an Irishman, and a Jesuit meant that he did not, in the end, wasn't awarded the DSO, still less the VC, although his commanding officer said that he had merited it many times over. The Royal Irish Fusiliers, he was in the 8th Royal Irish Fusiliers. I mean, he's many times mentioned in dispatches as well. A very heroic figure. But again, he's, how many Irishmen know about him? Not many. Nothing like as many as they should know. And there were many others like him, but not quite to his extent. But it's a forgotten story. The story of the Irish fighting in the First World War. One point, there is now a memorial at Messine Ridge, I think. What was Messine Ridge? Commemorating the Irish soldiers in the British Army, both Protestant and Catholic. It's a big, tall tower. One of the remarkable things about Willie Doyle is that his testimonials after the war, both for his medal and for his cause of canonization, came not only from Irish Catholics, but also from Ulster Protestants who had fought in the war and had seen him in action and had nothing but the highest praise for him. But all of that is unfortunately forgotten in Ireland because of the revolution and because of the Republic. And in the same way, well, perhaps less so in other countries. Obviously, France still has memorials, Italy, Germany, and Austria. And perhaps now they're given the respect and reverence that they are due, but not anything like we have in Britain. You don't really have the same sacred ceremonies of Remembrance Day in Germany and Austria that you have in Britain. Understandably, because, of course, if you celebrate the German army or the Austrian army, people tend to think that you're celebrating the armies that served Adolf Hitler. And that, of course, is now anathema to everybody, not least the Germans and Austrians. But it is a pity, because however futile that war was, the sacrifice of the soldiers concerned is nonetheless a very great and noble sacrifice.
Talking of chaplains, I'd like to get into the nationalistic fervour of some of the clergy and their rejection of Pope Benedict XV's peace plans, working there in concert with Blessed Karl. And one example that's quite telling is a small organisation called the Guild of the Pope's Peace, founded in Britain after the introduction of conscription in January 1916, and they existed to promote the Pope's call for a negotiated peace based on arbitration rather than the quest for total victory over Germany. It consisted of a committee of 7 people, including 2 priests. It issued a preliminary notice which explained that the Pope had invited all the friends of the peace in the world to help us in hastening the end of the war. The Bishop of Clifton, Ambrose Burton, wrote to the press publicly condemning the Guild. He said, whatever authority be behind this Stop the War Guild, it has no sanction or countenance from us and will receive none, as we trust, from any of our clergy and people, end quote. And two successive bishops of Nottingham, as well as Cardinal Bourne himself, who in a pastoral of 10th of September 1916 declared that ultimate victory depended on God alone and that Providence protected the Allies from victory by the enemy. He declared, quote, "The Pope has proposed that all the belligerents should come to a compromise. No, we demand the total triumph of right over wrong. We do not want a peace which will be no more than a truce or armistice between two wars. There may be in our land some people who want peace at any price, but they have no followers among us. We English Catholics are fully behind our war leaders," end quote. So it seems astounding that the chief pastor of Catholics in England and Wales should be so publicly disloyal to the Vicar of Christ. But he wasn't the only one. The Archbishop of Brussels, who I mentioned before, he received Benedict's peace plan and failed to pass it on to the Belgian leaders.
Wow, I didn't know that. Yes. And of course, that particular extreme nationalism, which above all Catholics should have understood and rejected. When I say nationalism, extreme nationalism, I mean the philosophy of my country, right or wrong, which, as George Orwell put it, is about as ridiculous as saying my mother drunk or sober. Mm-hmm. That Catholics, above all, should have been inoculated against. Protestants less so, because their churches were more closely connected to the nation. They were Protestantism, of course. The Protestant Reformation or Revolution was the beginning of modern nationalism, and many of the lay Protestant leaders saw the opportunity presented to them by Protestantism to augment their national hegemony by means of having a national church. Henry VIII, of course, classically, but not just him. That being the birth of modern nationalism, it almost, if it was to get the upper hand, which in the 19th century it did, almost inevitably led, as night follows day, to a bloodbath like the First World War. So you can actually trace the roots right the way back to the Protestant Reformation.
Right.
And out of that, you then get Protestant clerics who are, and not all of them, because many were much more noble than this, but many were not, who were just fanatical nationalists. And they thought that part of their role as clergymen was to beat the nationalist drum, particularly in wartime. And a lot of Catholics, and this all, unfortunately, as you and I know only too well, is all too typical of weak-minded Catholics, just followed suit slavishly, like Catholics now follow suit with the sort of ecumenia, as I call it, of some Protestants, because they don't consider what the true Catholic position is, and then adopt it. They just slavishly copy everybody else, which is, in a way, a kind of repudiation of their own Catholic faith. But nonetheless, that is what happened. And the classic example came after the First World War, when you had a great swelling of nationalist movements all over Europe, none of which could possibly, well, at least they couldn't all survive and thrive equally, because each of them was demanding territory from the other, which they as nationalists claimed and thought was more important than peace, which of course also helped to prepare the way for the Second World War. So you know, some of the more extreme examples of which one can imagine there had been clerics beating the drum with a similar fervor during the First World War, I think must be the Romanian Iron Guard, or the I think they were called the Militia of St. Michael, the Archangel. where you had Romanian Orthodox fanatics like Codreanu and others who endorsed a sort of utterly fanatical nationalist position, every bit as crazy as the Nazis, and in some ways even crazier. And so inevitably, because nationalism takes root, you then get its cousin, which is racism, because you consider that your nation, in order to be the nation, has got to consist of the particular race that personifies that nation. And so that excludes Jews, foreigners, you name it. And we know where that led. Interestingly, in Germany, something that is widely forgotten, with all this nonsense about Hitler's Pope, everybody completely forgets about Hitler's Protestants. And a very large section of the Lutheran Church of Germany very quickly fell in line behind what was called the Deutsche Christenbewegung, the German Christian movement, who were completely pro-Hitler and Nazi. Not only that, they wanted to edit the Bible, the New Testament, to get rid of what they considered to be Judaisms. And Hitler appointed a Reich Bischof, a bishop of the Reich, Ludwig Müller, to head up the Deutsche Christenbewegung. And it wasn't until pretty late on in the war that you got the so-called movement of the confessing churches, the Bekenntniskirche, that produced people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. That came pretty late in the piece. Of course, not all Lutherans sided with Hitler, but there was a very substantial German Christian movement. You didn't have a Catholic, German Catholic movement supporting Hitler. I mean, if there was one, it was tiny, if it even existed. What you had was people who either kept silent or were actively opponents of Hitler, like Bishop von Galen. Whilst in Austria, Cardinal Initzer, and in Poland, Cardinal Plond, I think it was, initially supported Hitler, they later repudiated their initial support. And certainly in other countries, there was a very, anyone who had read Mein Kampf pretty quickly got an idea of where it was all going. Now, you must have had similar extremist fanatics during the First World War, beating the drum for the particular country, whether it was France, whether it was Belgium, whether it was Italy, whether it was Germany, whether it was whatever, and as you rightly just quoted, and in Britain, who with a degree of short-sightedness, if not indeed downright stupidity, thought it was perfectly all right to beat the drum for a war that should never have taken place in the first place and should have been ended as quickly as it began, and in so doing were utterly opposed to the lay and clerical head or vicars of their own religion, namely the Pope, Benedict XV, and the last remaining Catholic emperor, the Emperor Karl. So how they justified that in their own minds is quite extraordinary. Not only to us now, looking back with retrospect, but must to any sane person have seemed equally, or perhaps not quite so equally, but nonetheless very much so, to be utter craziness, even at the time, particularly once you had all the terrible slaughter of the Somme, of Verdun, of the Italian front, Isonzo, and so on, and on the Russian front. But no, you still get fanatics who think it's a good idea. Don't forget that the great campaigner for women's rights, Emmeline Pankhurst, and her daughters, all of whom were stomping up and down British streets, demanding votes for women, and in the cases of some of them, throwing themselves under the king's horse at Ascot. Was it? I think it was at Ascot. It might have been at one of the other racetracks, to demand votes for women. As soon as the war started, what were they doing? Were they saying we must have peace? The government must negotiate? No, no. They would go out into the streets and hand out white feathers to young men who were walking the streets in civilian clothing and saying, why aren't you out at the front? So they were as belligerent, if not more belligerent, than the very worst of the extremist nationalists, the very people, the very women who had been demanding votes for women on the basis that this would bring a better complexion to government. Well, maybe, but not if it was going to be Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters. So, there was a lot of craziness about at the time. I suppose is the best construction one can put on it. If not craziness, then just outright evil. The people who ultimately saw that it was evil tended to be the soldiers themselves. And so you get people writing like Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, trying to impress upon a British reading and intelligent public, so far as they read it at all, the sheer futility and horror of modern war as it was being fought in the trenches of the First World War.
Yes, one of the most notorious was the Anglican Bishop of London, Arthur Winnington Ingram, who in 1915 in a sermon urged British soldiers to, quote, kill Germans, do kill them, not for the sake of killing, but to save the world, to kill the good as well as the bad, to kill the young as well as the old. I look upon it as a war for purity, end quote.
Well, there you are.
A Dominican professor at the Institut Catholique, P. Setelejean, declared in the presence of the Archbishop of Paris, Cardinal Armet, Holy Father, for the time we are unable to listen to your words of peace, Benedict XV. Like the apparent rebel in the gospel, we are sons who reply, no, no. We're honoured to be joined by Mr. Charles Coulombe, another historian and author of a biography of Blessed Charles of Austria, a bright saintly figure in this dark picture. It's great to be with two authors here who have written books on Blessed Charles of Austria.
Well, thank you. It's great to be back. Great to be here. Great to see you both. The topic, of course, is a little depressing.
Yes, and we've been focusing on some of the most dark moments in this cataclysm, this hecatomb of Christendom, what Pope Benedict XV called the suicide of Europe in 1916. Colonel Bogle has discussed a little about Blessed Charles's peace plans, but I wonder in your research what has emerged for you in his efforts, kind of most saliently, and why those efforts were frustrated by those around him.
Well, I think, and I hope I won't be repeating too much of what the eminent colonel has said, but one of the things to be remembered about Emperor Karl is that he was above and beyond all else truly a knight, truly a chivalrous soldier. And I say this not simply because he was a Knight of Malta, a Knight of the Golden Fleece, etc. When he was a teenager, and when archdukes of his house were supposed pro forma to become Knights of the Golden Fleece, he wouldn't do it until the statutes were translated out of Burgundian French into German, so that he could see them for himself and make sure that he could live up to those statutes. And they became a big part of what was already a highly developed spiritual life. One of the things about the Habsburgs, like actually every Catholic royal family, is that they had a particular version of Catholic piety, Catholic devotion, specific to them. With the French, it was called the Religion Royale, but with the Habsburgs, it was the Pietas Austriaca. There was a great deal of emphasis on sacrifice, on the Holy Cross, the Blessed Sacrament, latterly the Sacred Heart, and of course the Blessed Virgin Mary. But again, in a very chivalrous manner. And as with knights everywhere, the reason why the old orders of knighthood took the cross as their symbol, greater love hath no man than to lay down his life for his friends, was, if you want knighthood in one sentence, that was it. And the knights of old saw what they did in union with the sacrifice of Christ. Now, all that's important to understand because it was Blessed Karl's approach to knighthood and to governance itself. So, he had opposed the war from the beginning. He was a soldier, and as St. Ambrose teaches us, it's not up to the soldier to decide on the justice or otherwise of a war that he's engaged in fighting. It's only up to him to fight it like a Christian and not a pagan. And so long as he was an imperial officer fighting in the First World War for his great uncle, the emperor, that's what he did. But he was against the war. He thought it would have terrible consequences. Although he had a good personal relationship with Kaiser Wilhelm, as both he and his uncle, Franz Ferdinand, feared. When the war broke out, power very, very quickly, to the degree that the Kaiser Wilhelm had any, it very quickly shifted to the generals, specifically to Hindenburg and Ludendorff. One of the things I think ought to be pointed out, and people don't, about the First War, is that in the so-called absolute monarchies of Eastern Europe, Germany, Austria to a great degree, but far from entirely, but certainly Russia, power was no longer really in the hands of either Kaiser Wilhelm or Tsar Nicholas. How do we know this? Well, simple. 1905, the two of them, they were cousins, they were close friends, they go for a sail together in the Baltic, and the result, they sign a treaty of alliance, non-aggression, etc. The minute the two of them get back to their own capitals, their quote-unquote respective governments denounce the treaty. So that tells you that the political class were already in charge in both of those countries. In Russia, you had a head of the so-called Peace Party named Pyotr Stolypin, who was murdered in 1912. After that, there was no one really effective to lead the Peace Party. In Austria-Hungary, the leader of the Peace Party was Franz Ferdinand. And so his murder was a double blow. Not only did it start the war, but it removed the most able proponent of peace, both internal and external, that the empire had. And with his departure, Berchtold and people like that had sort of free rein. Franz Joseph, who had, unlike Berchtold and these other people, had actually been in battle, he was very much against the war. But they said, oh, well, you don't have a choice. We've got to do it. We've got to do it. We've got to do it. Karl certainly was in no position to do anything. Now he becomes emperor 2 years later. From the beginning, he tries everything he can to end the war as quickly as possible. But unfortunately, neither his allies, the Germans, nor the opponents, the French, the British, and the Americans eventually, were interested in peace without total victory for their side. And this is a terrible, terrible recipe for horror. This is a little off topic, but not much. One of the things that strikes the American historian is how much events in the American Civil War prefigured what would happen in World War I. So many of the European chiefs of staff went into the war thinking it was going to be another Napoleonic sort of thing, maybe Franco-Prussian. But everything that would come to characterize the First War, French warfare and its horrors, aerial warfare, submarines, warfare against civilians, They were prefigured in the American Civil War. If you could have thought of what we did then, plus 50 years of increasing technology, the Gatling gun to the machine gun, they would have had a better idea of what was going to happen. But, there's an old saying, you fight the last war, not this one. And it's sadly true. Anyway, the other point I want to make, though, is that Blessed Emperor Charles felt that it was his absolute duty to seek peace at any price, consequent with honor. So unfortunately, he didn't feel he could simply throw his allies to the wolves. He didn't feel that he could simply pull a separate peace, and that hampered him severely. It also didn't help that the Allies were all for peace only when they were losing, and that his German allies were only for peace when they were losing. As soon as there was any prospect of victory on either side, forget about peace. The other thing that my research has shown me that I thought was sort of interesting, there were 3 other figures that were looking for peace and went through similar run-ins with their politicians as he did with his. King Albert of the Belgians, King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy, and Alfonso XIII of Spain. Now, of course, Alfonso XIII was a neutral, so there wasn't that much you could say. But you read the stories of these 3 monarchs, and they're separate because they really were not in touch with each other. They're separate attempts to try to bring about a peace. And time again, they're generals, they're quote-unquote generals, they're quote-unquote politicians. Oh, no, it's simply not possible. It's simply not possible. Which leads one to a horrible possibility that perhaps not only the outbreak of the war, but its continuance, year after bloody year, is to be laid at the feet of the democratically elected representatives of the people and their associates in the military. It's interesting, too, that when Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, the Austrian government, Berchtold now being at the helm, presented Serbia with a list of demands. These demands were actually not at all unreasonable, given the terrible crime that had just taken place. Not at all. And Berchtold was afraid the Serbs would accept them because they were so reasonable. And the funny thing is, too, that the man who was responsible for Franz Ferdinand's death, Apis, the head of the Serbian secret police, they would execute him themselves 2 years later, or 3 years later. So you say, well, wait a minute, all that being the case, why didn't they just hand him over? Well, the answer was simple. In November, the Serbian government were facing another election. And they didn't believe they could afford to look weak in front of Austria for the sake of the election. I mean, again, another triumph for the people, I guess. I don't know what else to call it.
One of your favorite democratically elected representatives, President Woodrow Wilson, on hearing about Pope Benedict XV's peace initiative, famously said, what does he want to go butting in for? And then he would go and adopt many of Benedict's points for his own 14 points and appropriate them, taking all the credit.
Yes. Well, Woodrow, and then, of course, he turned around and reneged on the 14 points later on, especially with regard to Austria-Hungary. And the funny thing about Wilson, too, he had been spoiling to get into the war. Now, mind you, while we were a neutral power, the war had done us a powerful lot of good, in the sense that we went from being, for the first time in our history, from being a debtor nation to being a creditor nation. And at that point, the financial center of the world over the course of the First War, by 1915, 1916, shifted from the city of London to Wall Street, where it is, we hope, comfortably resided ever since. Now, that having been said, he ran the campaign of the election of 1916 on the motto, "He kept us out of war." But as soon as he was firmly ensconced in his second term, he began to push. The Zimmerman telegram that brought us in the war, ostensibly, you may recall, was supposedly a note from the German Foreign Office to their ambassador in Mexico, offering Mexico the American Southwest if they would declare war on the United States in the event of war. The problem with that is that Mexico was in the midst of a civil war. They weren't going to declare war on anybody. They were already doing it to themselves. They didn't need help. So that was the first problem there. The second was that after Wilson declared war on Germany, we did not declare war on Austria. That would not happen for a number of months. And the reason why it happened, finally, is that the Austrians defeated the Italians very, very badly at a place called Caporetto, and the Italian front collapsed. Woodrow Wilson wanted to rush American troops into Italy to shore up the Italians. But of course, the problem with that was that we were neutral. And, in those days, we couldn't just say, okay, we're coming now to fight. You had to have a declaration of war. So he brought up a declaration of war against Austria. And the reason was really, really tremendous. The casus belli was a group of Americans were on a neutral ship that was torpedoed in the Mediterranean by a U-boat. They were rescued, dropped off at a neutral port. It was claimed that the U-boat was Austrian. So they're asked in the Senate, they're grilled in the hearings prior to the declaration of war, how do you know they were Austrian? They were speaking Austrian. Well, if that isn't proof of something, I don't know what is. But so we got into the war against Austria. And the funny thing is, Charles, going back to him for a moment, blessed Emperor Karl, he disagreed with his German allies in three areas in particular. And every time, they had the clout. He didn't, so he was overruled. One was the use of gas. Two was unrestricted submarine warfare, which he was absolutely sure would bring the United States into the war. And guess what? It did. Thirdly and lastly, however, he was against smuggling a certain individual into Russia by the name of Vladimir Lenin. The Germans had wanted to smuggle Lenin into Russia through Austria. And they wanted to smuggle an Italian communist, whose name escapes me, into Italy via Austria. Well, Karl was in a position to say, no, the Italian's not going to Italy. But he couldn't keep Lenin from going to Russia. All he could do is forbid them the use of Austrian territory, which he did. In looking at that whole affair, at the whole conduct of the war, the emperor himself was probably the sanest of any of the effective heads of state or heads of government as well in Europe. He was the only one who had seen war face to face, with the exception of Victor Emmanuel and King Albert. And what do we know? Well, they too sought in their ways for peace. But the heads of government, the politicians, the people who so blithely rejected any effort toward peace, they never saw the war. They weren't a part of it. And I've always remembered saying that my father had after World War II, which was really it's a pity that the politicians can't fight the wars first, show us how it's done, and then deploy the armies.
Yeah, exactly.
But I don't want to sound anti-political class, though.
I think there was a moment in 1916, 1917, which represented the last chance to preserve something of the old order in Europe with Pope Benedict XV's peace initiative and the accession of Emperor Karl. And then in 1917, we see the real break with the old world. Colonel Bogle, you brought up the Russian Revolution earlier on, and I was quite surprised to find out that the fall of Tsarism had been welcomed as a liberating event and almost a victory at the Vatican, quote, noted Charles Lossu, who had been France's unofficial representative during the war. And he added, quote, that it was followed by a period of anarchy typified by Bolshevism's persecution against the ministers of all religions, but not dwelt upon in Rome. He also observed that the papacy recognized the fall of the Roman Empire with almost as much satisfaction that he's talking about, recognized the fall of the Russian Empire with almost as much satisfaction as the socialists themselves, end quote. What do you think accounts for this, very short-sighted interpretation of the Russian Revolution, the fall of the Tsar?
Were they suggesting that it was the Pope who was thinking that, or just some Vatican officials?
This is the French Observer. He doesn't say. I guess he's talking about the atmosphere in the Curia at the time, perhaps.
I'd be very surprised if Benedict XV thought anything along those lines, and certainly past the 10th wouldn't have done. But I'm not surprised that there were. I say the Vatican, but of course there wasn't a Vatican. The Vatican didn't come into existence until 1929. The Roman Curia, the Holy See. I'm not surprised that there would have been some clerics like that, because as we were discussing earlier, there were extreme nationalist clerics, not only Protestants but also Catholic, who were enthusiastically supporting the war. So I'm not at all surprised that in the same wrong-headed, ill-instructed, and frankly downright stupid way, there would have been some clerics who would have rejoiced at the fall of the Tsar, because he was not Catholic, he was Orthodox. But again, the short-sightedness of that, the sheer myopia, is hard to credit. But even in those days, let alone now. But I'd be very surprised if Pope Benedict XV thought along those lines, because he was always very much like the Emperor Charles, striving for peace. I don't know if Charles knows anything about this. Do you?
I think too that Colonel Bogle was really hit on a big problem there, and that was the Polish issue and the Lithuanians. I mean, in a sense, it's a bit like the difficulty with the Irish issue, in that it's a very, very complex, a very difficult thing. It's interesting that Gregory XVI had condemned risings both in Ireland and in Poland. And that, again, that obviously was not happily received by a great many of their Irish and Polish, of his Irish and Polish subjects. But the alternative he saw to be worse, which was revolution and the taking of power by the worst kinds of Irish and Poles. And arguably that happened in the end. And to bear in mind, you have the same thing in most secular circles in the United States, in Europe. Truly, the overthrow of the Tsar was one of the things that definitely cleared the way in Woodrow Wilson's mind for joining the Allies, because we would not be allying with this horrific tyranny. It's also important to bear in mind that with liberal folk like that, Alexander Kerensky, whom Eric von Kuehne-Ledeen labeled one of the four stupidest European politicians of the 20th century, nevertheless, he was considered quite the hero in America, in France. The George Washington of Russia was the phrase that they actually would use of him. Blindness and stupidity, unfortunately, are always amongst us. But in World War I, it seemed like there were double helpings all around. And the few people that could see what the story was were punished for it. There's, the old saying, in the country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Well, my father used to say that's not true. In the country of the blind, the one-eyed man gets his eye put out. The minute he opens his mouth. But
Indeed.
It's a sad thing, and the hubris on the part of Woodrow Wilson, and you mentioned 1917 was the end of the old order. Well, that's true, but it was certainly the idea of men like Wilson in my country and people like Clemenceau. Not so much, I think, Lloyd George, who was simply an opportunist in my estimation. But for people like Wilson and Clemenceau, they saw this as a way to literally create a new order, to build a new reality. And they truly had the hubris to think that they could construct it, they could construct something real out of their own imaginings. It's astonishing when you think about it. You take an institution like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, like Russia, like the Russian Tsar, and even the German states to a great degree. You really think you can replace them with something better? Based on what? Being president of Princeton. I see. That too is an old American joke that Wilson took into motion when he became president of the United States.
Yes, President Wilson was a particularly stupid man. Sad to say.
He was. He was, and also a very damaged man. One of the things about Wilson, and this today, of course, is denounced as a great racist, which is sort of a third or fourth force coming into our considerations without any apparent meaning. But in fact, Wilson had been raised in Reconstruction era Virginia, when he had seen everyone who served the Confederate Army or government absolutely deprived of civil rights. And it embittered him. So he becomes president. What does he do? He extends the Jim Crow laws to the District of Columbia, which had not had them before. and again, why? Somehow the district had managed to get along without them. But the great savior of the human race saw Jim Crow as the way out for DC. So you really couldn't expect much better from him for Europe.
Well, indeed. But I mean, there were also, not everything is, bad though the First World War was, and you couldn't really get much worse. Even so, some remarkable things came out of it. Not least, as I was mentioning earlier, the role of the Catholic chaplains. I'm just reading a piece by Father Schofield, Nicholas Schofield, who is a priest over here in London, which he wrote for Faith magazine, and he quotes a rather fascinating, not to say startling, extract from the diary of the Irish Jesuit I mentioned earlier, Father Willie Doyle, S.J., who was at the time of his death during the Battle of Passchendaele in 1917, was, as I think I said, attached to the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. He said he'd been seen all day. Well, it was said of him that he'd been seen all day hither and thither over the battlefield like an angel of mercy. And he left many, as I say, vivid descriptions of the experiences in his diary, including this particular description of saying Mass in the trenches, which I'll read, if I may. He says this: by cutting a piece out of the side of the trench, I was just able to stand in front of my tiny altar, a biscuit tin supported by 2 German bayonets. God's angels, no doubt, were hovering overhead, but so were the shells, hundreds of them. And I was a little afraid that when the earth shook with the crash of the guns, the chalice might be overturned. Round about me on every side was the biggest congregation I ever had. Behind the altar, on either side and in front, row after row, sometimes crowding one upon the other, but all quiet and silent, as if they were straining their ears to catch every syllable of that tremendous act of sacrifice. But every man of them was dead. Some had lain there for a week and were foul and horrible to look at, with faces black and green. Others had only just fallen and seemed rather sleeping than dead. But there they lay, for none had time to bury them. Brave fellows every one, friend and foe alike, while I held in my unworthy hand the God of battles, their creator and their judge, and prayed to him to give rest to their souls. Surely that mass for the dead, in the midst of all, and surrounded by the dead, was an experience not easily to be forgotten. It's a remarkable tale. But that was Willie Doyle. But he wasn't the only one. I think something like 172 chaplains of all denominations were killed in action, and a very large number of those were Catholic. And the first chaplain to be killed, I think it was at Gallipoli, Father William Finn, who'd been working in the diocese of Middlesbrough, was attached also to the 1st Royal Dublin Fusiliers, was told to stay on the boat, but seeing all the casualties said, "The priest's place is beside the dying soldier. I must go." He was hit in the chest as he leapt onto the gangplank, but managed to attend to many of the wounded soldiers nonetheless, and was finally killed after receiving a head wound while administering the sacraments. He was posthumously awarded the Military Cross, but he got no higher decoration, it seems, because he disobeyed orders to remain in the safety of the boat. That was just another example, and there were many like it. My wife's grandfather, who was in the First War in the Norfolk, I think he was in the Norfolk Regiment. Yes, Bernard Campbell, was gassed twice. And on the second time, he was lying in no man's land, having been wounded and gassed. And suddenly a priest appeared over the top of him, an Irish priest, whispering to him, "Will I write to your wife?" And this so impressed him that after the war, he converted and became a Catholic priest. Many soldiers converted to the Catholic faith as a result of their experiences seeing Catholic chaplains jumping from hole to hole in no man's land in order to deliver the sacraments, particularly the anointing of the sick and dying in that war. And as I say, eventually Anglicans started to come over. But really, the no man's land was dominated by Catholic clergy and the Salvation Army. The result was that the war dispelled a lot of negative myths that had been obviously in circulation, particularly in Protestant countries like England, about Catholics, because many soldiers saw the courage of the Catholic chaplains and began to realize the tremendous power of the sacramental system, that meant so much to a chaplain that he would go and risk his life trying to give the sacraments to the dying out in no man's land. An Anglican, Guy Chapman, famously said that the Church of Rome, as he put it, sent a man into action spiritually cleansed, whereas the Church of England could only offer you a cigarette. It was perhaps a bit hard. But and of course, famously, Woodbine Willie was called Woodbine Willie because he would do precisely that, go into no man's land to offer a dying soldier a cigarette. But non-Catholic soldiers were more impressed by the tactile nature, if you like, of the Catholic religion. And many of them, non-Catholics, as well as Catholics, accepted gifts of medals and rosaries, even if they saw them as nothing more than a talisman or a lucky charm. Monsignor Bickerstaff Drew asked his aged mother to write to the convent at Roehampton, just down the road from where I live, to send him fresh supplies, saying, "I've given away about 1,200 and have none left. Medals, small crucifixes, rosaries, scapulars, Agnus Days. I could give away lots of them, and am always being asked for them by Catholic and non-Catholic alike." So even in the foams of sin and in that ghastly, horrible war, you had extraordinary testimony to not least the Catholic faith, but also other things, the courage of individual soldiers. And so it is said, even a few miracles. The famous story of the angels of Mons, but there were others as well. And as I say, I don't think it was without significance that the first day of the Battle of the Somme, when 60,000 British soldiers were wounded or killed, happens also to be the Feast of the Precious Blood, when you might say that precious blood in another form was spilled in that terrible war. Perhaps, who knows, subspecie aeternitatis, making up a recompense by sacrifice for the collapse of faith that had come in after the French Revolution and throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. Because we often forget that whereas there was a Catholic revival in England and to some extent in the rest of the British Isles and even in Ireland, the trend was very much the other way on the continent of Europe, with a number of notable exceptions, perhaps Flanders and the Netherlands. There was a growth in the Catholic religion, but in the rest of the continent of Europe, in Germany, France, Italy, and even Spain, you saw a massive retreat from the Catholic faith, particularly among the working and lower classes. And that, I am sure, was a contributing factor to the war, because nature abhors a vacuum. And as G.K. Chesterton famously said, when a man ceases to believe in God, he doesn't then believe in nothing, but rather in anything in order to fill the gap. And the particular thing that filled the gap was an almost idolatrous obsession with country and nationalism, which almost inevitably led to war. And since it was so widespread, led to the bloody conflagration, which was the First World War, and with the consequences we've seen.
I'd add to that a couple of other thoughts. One is, of course, the chaplains have so often, Catholic chaplains in so many conflicts, have been an extraordinary witness to the faith in so many ways. But it is interesting also to note that there was an effect World War I had on the Catholic liturgy. And that was that prior to World War I and since the Tridentine Reform, there had not been a proper preface for the Requiem Mass. And after the war, because there was so many casualties, Pope Benedict XV revived. He didn't have it newly made, but he revived from the pre-Tridentine rites a proper preface for the dead. and that was directly a response to the horrible bloodshedding. The other thing, too, about that war is that in England in particular, and in America, it began, again, the vast numbers of dead, began what I can only call the golden age of spiritualism and theosophy, which is why you had people like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who really should have known better, getting into table tapping and the Coningsby fairies and all that. Because it so shook civilization. You know, my grandfather, who lived through both wars, I asked him which was worse. And he said, well, of course, a lot more people died in World War II and this sort of thing. But World War I was really worse in terms of what it did to the European mind. In the sense that prior to 1914, there was this vague notion of progress. People were advancing. I mean, there were many, many different ways of interpreting how that was and so on. Even the nationalism of which you speak was sort of connected to the scientificism of the day. And then in 4 years, all that was smashed completely. It wasn't just the remnants of the old order in the three monarchies that was destroyed. It was the confidence with which most Europeans had faced the future. The early H.G. Wells, the idea that science was going to solve everything. Who was the fellow, the social Darwinian who was so popular? I can't think of his name, a sociologist, but he wrote half the entries of the 1911 Britannica having to do with sociology and civilization. And it was shown up in 4 years to be myth. And in some ways, of course, this was a great thing for the church, especially in English-speaking countries, because it did open up a vast field of evangelization. You were mentioning Siegfried Sassoon earlier. He converted. A number of the war poets converted. But what a cost. What a cost. And I think as far as Wilson's intervention of the war goes, I really believe that you can't get better than Churchill's comment on it, which was that Wilson's insistence on getting rid of the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollerns, and the rest, the Wittelsbachs and so on, led directly both to the rise of Hitler and then the dominance of Stalin over Central Europe. And I don't think there's any way any intelligent person can say otherwise. Part of the problem too, and this also came from our Civil War, the whole idea of unconditional surrender, which is immoral, in my humble opinion. It leaves your opponent with no way out, or you with no way out. And it forces the two sides to go on until one of them simply can't. As opposed to, all right, well, you know what? We're not really getting anywhere. Let's have a negotiated peace. We'll all go back to our corners and, come back and play later. No. We've got to push through to absolute victory. Yeah. On whose back and whose blood. And that doctrine, which, as I say, originated in our Civil War, was certainly in Mr. Wilson's mind. And he got what he wanted. And it was in FDR's mind. One wonders if the Allies have been willing to say, get rid of Hitler, get rid of Tojo, and we'll talk. How much sooner would those wars have ended? And would the Soviets have been in the center of Europe? Would China fall under the communists. I know they say those whom the gods have destroyed, they first make mad, but the sad thing too, as I say, is World War II showed the statesmen of the West didn't really learn a lot.
Yeah.
Certainly the Americans didn't.
Well,
And
we were just saying
sorry?
look at the Ukraine-Russia war. Have we not learned the lesson? Apparently not. Apparently, but shamefully, the British and American governments are saying, no, we're going to go fighting on until the Ukrainians have won. And no matter how many times people say to them, well, sorry, but they're losing. And they've lost 1 million dead already. And their country is being devastated. No, give them another 50 billion. We're going to win. I mean, that's the sort of stupid mentality the politicians adopted during the First World War. Mm-hmm. So if we haven't learned that lesson, when will we ever learn it?
Well, firstly, I think you're expecting a lot out of a senile gentleman. That it's a lot to demand out of my president. And I'm glad that as a newly minted senior citizen myself, I look at President Biden, I look at President Hindenburg, and I'm very happy to see that senility need not be a block to public service. I think this is an important point. But seriously,
I think we should go back to your comment and ask Mr. Joe Biden and his friends like Miss Nancy Pelosi if they would like to go out and fight the war first, and then we'll send the soldiers and the money.
Well,
that might just have a salutary effect.
Somehow I doubt that. And of course, there too, though, you've also touched on another important point, and that is, unlike World War II and unlike World War I, it is no longer in the Western countries the children of the rulership who are fighting these wars. I mean, as you know, a big part of the problem with World War I was that quite literally the brightest and the best on all sides were the first ones into the grinder. And a lot of political families lost their best members, again, in each country.
Yeah.
Well, that doesn't happen today. You didn't see a whole bunch of Rockefellers and so forth dying in Afghanistan.
Well, exactly. Because, I mean, in the First World War, Churchill had been a member of the British War Cabinet, and he was still a member of Parliament. I think he was still in the government. I can't remember because he was First Lord of the Admiralty at one stage, but I think he may still be. And he said, right, well, I think he'd been perhaps sacked from the government, but was still in the governing party. So he put on uniform, went to France, and he was made CO, despite being a fourth hussar, which was now merged with my old regiment to form the Queen's Royal Hussars. He went out and commanded the Royal Scots Fusiliers, and famously put on a French poilu's helmet as his sort of pièce de résistance. Fought in the trenches for I can't remember how long before he came back to Parliament. Well, can you imagine anyone doing that now?
No
way,
never.
Jose. Simply wouldn't happen. And of course, you had people like the actual Prime Minister's son, Herbert Asquith's son, Raymond Asquith, yes, who went out. I mean, he'd been a famously successful. He'd been the star of Balliol, got a triple first, I think. Went to the bar, became junior counsel to the Treasury in no time at all. Was famously in all sorts of big cases, including the inquiry into the Titanic disaster. And then at the age of 39, beginning or shortly after the start of the First World War, goes out, volunteers, and is made a second lieutenant at the ripe old age of 39 in the Grenadier Guards, and is promptly killed. Likewise, Julian Grenfell, the Earl of Desborough's son, and numerous others. There was this sort of fervor. It was part patriotic, and part just sort of crazy nationalism. And so people thought, well, I'll expiate my sins by going and fighting in the trenches, which I suppose added fuel to the already existing fire of blazing nationalism, which had started the war in the first place. But as you rightly say, one notable feature is that ain't happening today. Hunter Biden is not rushing off to fight a war for the Ukrainians. He's too busy pushing things up his nose.
And we know. I mean, again, I don't want to get too far out of our original remit, but honestly, the separation. I mean, even in my own lifetime, one of the big differences between what we call in the States the Forever War, fought in the Near East, for 20 years, and Vietnam, is that because we had a conscript army at that time, everybody knew someone in Vietnam, some relation or a friend or something. And we saw it every night on television. It was every night we saw it. But with this 20-year-long thing that we fought, because it was an all-volunteer army, if you were of a certain social class or above, you probably didn't know anyone who was, on the bottom fighting it. And number two, it never appeared on television. You just didn't see it. It was all off screen.
Well, exactly.
So the great American public was uninvolved as the American ruling classes. But nevertheless, you had all these young people out there fighting and dying for the Stars and Stripes.
Yeah. Well, this is what I was saying earlier to Theo, was the situation of the war now is very different from what it was in times past when, in the Middle Ages, the nobility would fight with a few professional soldiers and the rest of the nation were aware of it, obviously, because it was bruited about when a victory was won, but it was pretty much remote to them in their everyday lives. Whereas modern warfare, you can't escape the cost of it, the publicity of it, the many lies that are told about it, and just because of the nature and state of the technology, you can't really have wars between nations like you used to have. It's too costly in terms of lives and treasure. And this Russian-Ukrainian war is a classic example. I mean, it's been going on for how long now? 18 months or more, 2 years now? Mm-hmm. And, you've got, 1 million Ukrainians have, if what we're told is correct, have died. God knows what the damage to the Ukrainian infrastructure is. And America has already sent over hundreds of, 50 or 100 billion or more. And now the European Union has pledged 50 billion euros. I mean, colossal waste of taxpayers' money. They will, of course, the newspapers describe it as EU money or congressional money. It's neither. It's taxpayers' money being thrown down the tubes for no good reason. So you can't really have that sort of war anymore. I think it's the only armed forces now are really designed for peacekeeping operations, internal security operations, counterinsurgency, and perhaps wars like the Falklands War. But you can't have great wars between nations. It's just too costly. But the same stupid mentality that prevailed among politicians in the First World War has not died a death. It carries on to this day.
Isn't it good to know that some traditions survive?
All the bad ones, by the looks of it.
Well, still. No,
but unlike I don't know whether whether anything good has come out of it at all. But there were some interesting developments, as I was saying earlier, in the First World War. I remember reading somewhere a priest writing in 1930 said that either directly or indirectly through the war, a large number of individuals had been received into the Catholic Church who are, otherwise, humanly speaking, would have remained outside of it. And some people have suggested that in England alone, as many as 70,000 soldiers converted to the Catholic faith, which they certainly wouldn't have done if they hadn't been, in the trenches or in no man's land. And the other thing about the war, which I think it's fair to say, not that this is a good reason for having a war, of course not, but good things can come out sometimes out of bad. It helped Catholicize parts of British culture. We take that for granted now, but it was a noticeable difference pre-war from post-war. For example, for many soldiers, it was their first experience of going to a country that had Catholic roots and a landscape with churches and convents, shrines, statues. And so there was even a British organization called, I think, something like the Wayside Cross Society, which aimed to promote the erection, both as memorials and places of prayer, of wayside crosses, because that's what they did on the continent. It was eventually closed down in 1919 because even as late as 1919, crucifixes were still deemed to be too popish for the English. But now, of course, it's quite normal. And as we know, in the Church of England, the huge number of casualties really inspired, I don't know whether inspire is the right word, it almost compelled the Church of England to adopt some sort of prayer for the dead, which historically they would have been reluctant to do because Protestants don't normally pray for the dead, which originally had been one of the most noticeable differences between Catholics and Protestants. But then came the war memorials, remembrance services, the tomb of the unknown soldier, and these were all, in effect, to some degree at any rate, inspired by Catholic practices, particularly Catholic practices the soldiers had seen on the continent. And so the established state Church of England began to offer it in a perhaps attenuated way to comfort the many, many thousands, hundreds of thousands of bereaved families. And that's hardly surprising. And in France and Belgium, the soldiers commented on the survival of religious images in an almost, it's I won't say miraculous, but a remarkable way. One soldier wrote in 1915, I'm just looking at something that he wrote, I think this is it here. It is little short of miraculous how the wayside shrines and statues inserted in the front of houses have escaped injury. In at least half a dozen cases, I've seen the whole front of a house wrecked by shells, except the niche from which a statue of Our Lady or the Sacred Heart held out outstretched arms to passers-by. Then there was the Church of Notre Dame in Albert, where the German bombardment caused the gilded statue of the Virgin and Child on top of the steeple to lean forward almost at a right angle. And one officer wrote, "It is really wonderful and perhaps miraculous. The statue is huge with an immense base of metal. All the girders which used to support it are smashed. The statue appears to be suspended in midair. And according to legend, when the Virgin fell, the war would end," which almost proved to be the case because the leading Virgin fell only a couple of months before the armistice. So there were these sorts of stories circulating among British and Commonwealth soldiers, I think did a great deal to break down barriers between the Protestants and Catholics and to made Catholics more a mainstream part of the British and Commonwealth society in a way that we now accept as routine and mainstream, but was much less so the case before the First World War. Not a good reason for having a First World War, I hasten to add, but even that terrible bloody cloud wasn't without a little bit of silver lining, I'm happy to say, trying to find something good to say about an otherwise appalling disaster.
God brings good out of evil. And of course, the same was also true to some degree in the United States, in the sense that we were a much more segregated society religiously before the war. and the actions of American chaplains, of American Catholic chaplains, and particularly of the organization called the Knights of Columbus on the front line, the American Expeditionary Force, made a huge, huge impression. It was also, interestingly enough, the first time that the bishops of the United States had formed a permanent organization. They had plenary councils before, but they hadn't had an organization. And that organization was called the National Catholic War Council. Well, obviously, after the war, that name couldn't stick. So it became the National Catholic Welfare Conference. And then finally became the National Conference of Catholic Bishops. But the thing is that, God does bring good out of evil. And there are, one of the things about war is that, well, many people save their souls that wouldn't have, and perhaps some lose their souls that might not have. There's a story I've been drawing while we've been talking to remember the particulars, but it was a relatively famous story at the time of a French soldier on the front who was about to kill a wounded German. And either he saw the German's rosary or the German saw his rosary, but whatever the case, he didn't do it as a result. And then years later, they met again in the Second War, and the German was a priest. And, there was a lot of that sort of thing. But as you say, it doesn't really make up for the whole mess.
No, that's right. That's right, indeed. It's called The Next War by Wilfred Owen. I don't know if you know it, but it goes like this. Out there, we've walked quite friendly up to death, sat down and eaten with him, cool and bland, pardoned his spilling mess tins in our hand. We've sniffed the green, thick odor of his breath. Our eyes wept, but our courage didn't rise. He spat at us with bullets, and he's coughed shrapnel. We chorused when he sang aloft. We whistled while he shaved us with his scythe. Oh, death was never enemy of ours. We laughed at him. We leagued with him, old chum. No soldiers paid to kick against his powers. We laughed, knowing that better men would come and greater wars. When each proud fighter brags, he wars on death for life, not men for flags.